We are just delighted that you can join us today. As Tammy said, it's where you get to see all your peeps. And so we're glad to collect and connect across the province. Angela, that haircut is looking fantastic. You bet. So over the course of today, you're going to hear Sara Florence Davidson share. We're calling them 3 chunks of goodness. I don't know if that's what you want to call them, Sara, but there's kind of 3 pieces, and after each is a reflection opportunity. This series is a 3-part series. It's our 2nd year, and it's called Engaging All Learners in the Secondary Years. And so in the first session, we heard from Erica Fitzen and Emma Milliken and Denise Augustine. In this session, we're so just thrilled to have Haida scholar Dr. Sara Davidson. And in the final session, we're going to look at literacy across the curriculum with Tammy Renyard, who's here co-hosting with me today, along with Heather Brown and Vicki Roberts. My name's Leyton Schnellert, and I get to be your MC, your happy, upbeat MC. I am going to, the last thing I should mention before I pass to Tammy is that the series is co-created, co-sponsored by the BC Teachers of English Language Arts, the Greater Victoria School District, the Rural Education Advisory, and the Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center as a way to connect people across the province in the work that we do. And now I'll pass to my amazing colleague, Tammy Renyard.
Thanks, Leyton. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tammy Renyard, and I have the privilege of being a district principal in the Greater Victoria School District. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm a settler on the traditional territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, the Lekwungen-speaking people. School District 61 is really grateful to connect with you, with Leyton and Sara today. These sessions grew out of a desire to provide equitable access to quality professional learning across the province. And we're in year 2 of the secondary option. And some of you may know the middle year series, which is in year 4, and we started elementary this year. And so we're just so grateful to be able to have these shared conversations across the province. We hope that together we seed ideas that grow and make a difference for children, students, educators in our province. I'm really looking forward to participating with you today. Thanks so much. Over to you, Leyton.
Great. I should mention that we have some funding from the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Education. And now I get to introduce you to my frolic, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Sara Florence Davidson. We met during our grad work, didn't we, Sara? And we and a group of other folks just connected together in relationship. Went for dinner, hung out, and have stayed connected in various ways for a while now, like 15 years, perhaps, or more. Sara's work centers literacy as a practice. Her work welcomes children, educators, and community members together, recognizing their funds of knowledge, and that learning and knowledge comes from within us, but it's also situated in context. Her work both inspires me and provokes me, and I always know when Sara says we need to have a talk, it's something that I need to hear. So Sara, we're just delighted that you're here to share with us doing the work that you do. And we're also just excited that you get to be in your favorite wheelhouse, which is literacy and story.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm hopeful that the technology will cooperate. Woohoo! There we go. So yes, I panicked when Leyton started with the math, because I actually do not know how many years it's been, and I think I want to say 2005 is maybe where I want to say, because I was starting my master's and I was in a class with Carl Lago and a bunch of really, really amazing folks. And what was really intimidating was that I was beginning my master's and there were folks in there doing their PhD. I didn't know that they did that combination of things, and it felt overwhelming to be around all of that knowledge. But
Slides are on the move and you're on mute now.
Okay.
You're back.
Feel free to just let me know if I'm randomly muted. Okay. I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo people. And this photograph was taken on a walk with a friend of mine. And I'm so grateful to be here on this territory, and also to be able to enjoy the nature and the land. This was taken from Derby Reach Park, which is a beautiful park. But also recognizing that the reason that park is there for me to enjoy is because of the many years of caretaking that took place before other folks came to the territory. So very grateful to be here. And just as a brief introduction, this is a photograph that many of you may have seen before. It's the photograph that I use to introduce myself. And also really important to introduce myself in the context of my family and my community. And so this is a photograph of me when I was 3 years old. And this was right after I'm sorry, my pups are objecting to hearing my voice. So if you hear some strange music or noise in the background, that's what's happening. So this was taken shortly after my brother was born. You can see that I was making the transition from being an only child to being a sibling. And I can tell you that this photo is maybe capturing a moment that didn't last very long. I very quickly became a massive fan of my younger brother. He was an incredible human being. And so here is also my father, Haida artist Robert Davidson. His Haida name is Otsandlance, which means Eagle of the Dawn. He belongs to the Choth clan, which is an eagle clan. My mother, Susan Davidson, asks to be introduced as a colonizer, and she was adopted by my great-grandmother into the Yakutlanis clan, which is a Raven clan. And because the Haida are matrilineal, it means that we follow our mothers. And so that adoption gave my brother and I a place in the Haida community. Let's see here. This is a photograph that was taken of me at, I didn't even tell you my Haida name. So my Haida name is Anjak Gusandlats, which means Killer Whale Woman of the Dawn. And this is a photograph of me at the potlatch that is actually spoken about in Dancing with Our Ancestors, which is the 4th book in the Skata series. And so this is me talking a little bit, and I love using this photo because of the iPad there. So just a very brief snapshot into who I am. I grew up on unceded Stalo territories. I often traveled to Haida Gwaii. I became a member of the Rainbow Creek Dancers, which is a Haida dance group, traditional dance group, at the age of 7. That has really influenced my work, and it's important for me to recognize that because my father was born during the potlatch ban, so he was not able to participate in singing and dancing. And so I very lucky from a very young age to have been able to be a part of that. Graduated with a Bachelor of Science from Psychology from Dalhousie University, and eventually did PDP and as a Nuke Tech program with SFU up north, Paris, New Ianche, Prince Rupert, Masset on Haida Gwaii. And so very committed to rural education. I worked in Whitehorse and on Haida Gwaii as a teacher, generally with grades 8 to 12. I did some 6, 7 for a while, but really love working with adolescents and really passionate about English language arts. Did a PhD in literacy education, and then did extensive work in Indigenous education, both at the University of the Fraser Valley and now at Simon Fraser University. So, and very briefly here, I wanted to just share some of the books that I've written, co-authored with my father, my stepmother. So these are the books, some of the books that we'll be talking about today, but I love seeing them. It makes me feel happy to see so much color. So I worked with wonderful illustrators. So we're going to begin today talking just briefly about the kind of unlearning of some of the stories that we've been immersed in. And if we're talking about, Marie Batiste talks about us being marinated in these stories as part of our experiences as Canadians. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about working with traditional stories, and then a little bit more with nonfiction, or what I call learning stories. My focus is, my area of expertise, my classroom experience is working with secondary, but I really believe in a lot of the work that I do, that it can be used at any age. And I work with adults now, and all of the things that I will share with you, I do with adults. So even if it may seem like it's for younger folks, it can be used for younger folks, but even the picture books that I wrote are kind of 1,000-word narrative essays, if you will. So just keep that in mind, even though it may look like it's for young folks. In my mind, when I was creating a lot of this, I was thinking about older students. So when we're talking about colonization and decolonization, I've really appreciated the work of Dwayne Donald. And he specifically speaks to it as relationship denial. So thinking about colonization as relationship denial, and interfering with our relationship and relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. And so I've really appreciated that way of thinking, because relationship is really foundational to a lot of the work that I do. And I know that we can sometimes come to a space of discomfort when we're talking about colonization and decolonization. And so this sort of peeling back the layers and coming to a space of thinking about the foundational relationships has been really helpful for me. And so he says, for many generations, Canadians have been taught inside and outside school to deny relationships with Indigenous peoples. The habitual disregard of Indigenous peoples stems from the colonial experience and is perpetuated by the present educational context as a curricular and pedagogical logic of naturalized separation based on the assumption of stark and ultimately irreconcilable differences. So we often hear the terms decolonization and indigenization together. And I have, in conversations with folks, have people asking me, what are the differences between the two? Because sometimes people use them interchangeably. And my understanding, based on the work that I've done and the research that I've done and the reading and the listening, is that they are two very different terms. And they're really, they're taken up by, kind of led by different people and different groups of people. And so I really appreciate this work. And this is almost verbatim, or this is verbatim from pulling together a guide for frontline staff, student services and advisors, Open Text BC. It is an excellent and very accessible resource. And so I found these definitions to be really helpful. And so you'll see here, decolonization is about undoing, deconstructing colonial ideologies of superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches, dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo, valuing and revitalizing Indigenous knowledge and approaches, weeding out settler biases or assumptions that have impacted Indigenous ways of being. And for non-Indigenous people, it is about the process of examining your beliefs about Indigenous peoples and culture by learning about yourself in relationship to the communities where you live and the people with whom you interact. And this tends to be, some scholars will say it explicitly and some will sort of imply it, that this work is really where non-Indigenous folks can support and often lead work in this area. The work of indigenization is best led by Indigenous peoples, or in immediate collaboration with Indigenous peoples, because it's really important to understand the more specific nuances of a particular nation or a practice. And so it's not appropriate for non-Indigenous peoples to lead this work without really close connections. And often it would be about maybe making space for folks to engage directly with Indigenous voices and perspectives and contributions. So again, this is a collaborative process of naturalizing Indigenous intent, interactions, and processes, involves including Indigenous perspectives and approaches, seeks a fundamental shift in how Indigenous perspectives, values, and cultural understandings are included, Indigenous ways of knowing are positioned, how cultural protocols and practice are integrated into institutional practices. And this statement, this final statement, is what I find to be most helpful. When practiced, Indigenous peoples see themselves represented, respected, and valued, and all students benefit. And so we have in the past and sometimes still believe that our work in indigenization is solely for the benefit of Indigenous students. But what we've seen time and time again is that every student benefits, every educator benefits from this work of indigenization. And Leyton and I have done a ton of work in another project, so we could speak to that at another time. But for right now, what I'd like to just emphasize here is this work benefits all students. But we begin in the space of being mindful that we want to support Indigenous students. You may have seen this before, and it's really important for me to mention that in order for us to do the work of indigenizing, which can be quite exciting because it's newer, we have to do the work of decolonization first. We cannot just continue to add, as you know, continue to add things to our curriculum and engage with those ideas meaningfully. And so what that means, and the very, very brief example, some of you may have heard me share this before, is we think about those First Peoples principles of learning that were introduced in, I believe, 2012 with the curriculum, the English First Peoples curriculum. And what happened is they were beautiful posters that were posted on the walls and nothing ever came of them. And it wasn't until we shifted the curriculum, which I would argue is an act of engaging in decolonization, where we're rethinking about those, making space for Indigenous contribution. So we engaged in decolonization. We brought those First Peoples principles into the curriculum, and we've seen a big change, I would say, a big change in Indigenous education in what is now British Columbia. And so you'll notice that this is a cycle because it's not enough to just sort of do it once and stop. We want to continue to engage in this work. So I found this article by Morera and Luckett, and I found that it's called Questions Academics Can Ask to Decolonize Their Classroom. I adapted it a little bit to think specifically about working with Indigenous knowledges, contributions, but I found it to be a really helpful set of questions to think about as we're working to decolonize in our classroom. So what principles, norms, values, and worldviews inform my selection of knowledge for my teaching? And so in my work, and I'll speak to the questions a little bit in a moment, but I do think a lot about whose voices am I privileging in my classroom? Who is my ideal imagined student? And what assumptions do I make about their backgrounds, culture, languages, and schooling? Does my teaching reflect my geographical location? To what extent does it draw on Indigenous or local histories, voices, cultures, and languages? This one is quite an interesting one because of my partner has often asked me the question of, like, when you walk into a school, how is it that you know where your school is located? Is there, what do we see on the walls? What is the art that we see? What are the languages that we see posted? What are the images? What is it that we see when we come into a school that tells us the territory that the school is located on? Do I create space for students to learn from one another and draw on their own knowledge and sources? How do I assess students? This is a big question, so I'm going to mention it here. I'll let you know this is not the focus of our talk today, but there's lots of work to be done in how do we think about decolonizing and potentially indigenizing assessment. What can I do to make assessment equitable for all students? How can it draw on students' strengths? And do my teaching and assessment practices allow students to feel included without feeling pressured to assimilate? And this last point is really tricky because we have lots of different perspectives we have lots of different perspectives on what is important in teaching. And there's a wonderful quote by Leona Akakak who says that, you know, one of our goals is to prepare our students for the world that we live in today. And so recognizing that the world is not the world that maybe we would like it to be, but we still want our students to be ready for the world as it is today. And these are I will say there's a lot of tension in my practice in balancing how do I make room for all of those really amazing contributions that folks bring into my classroom, and how do I support them to be successful in what continues to be a very colonial space in mainstream education. So just thinking about that a little bit, and again, I'll leave that as something to ponder more. It's not where we're going today, but just I want to acknowledge the complexity of that space for so many folks. And when we're thinking about indigenizing and we're thinking about including Indigenous worldviews in our classroom materials, we're thinking about ways to center stories, films, books, music, art created by Indigenous peoples, explore Indigenous pedagogies such as storytelling and making meaning from stories, and seek Indigenous contributions to the curricular area. So thinking about actively seeking Indigenous contributions and making connections to local knowledge and stories as appropriate. Now pause and take a drink of tea because I'm tea powered. So when we're identifying resources to bring into our classroom and specifically to support indigenization, we want to be thinking about who developed the resource. So who was it? When I'm looking at resources, I am looking for people who are Indigenous, who have created the resource, or who are centered in the resource. So, and this can be tricky, especially now that we have folks, you know, we're learning more about folks who have falsely claimed Indigenous ancestry. And so it's really, really important to be vigilant in reviewing resources and making sure that if we are presenting them as Indigenous perspectives, that they have indeed been developed or co-developed with Indigenous peoples. How are Indigenous peoples represented in the resource? So we want to look through the resource and check out how people are being represented. I would say that we're getting a lot better. I created these, I created them quite a while ago, but in 2020, they were published in the BC Teacher magazine because I found that I was getting asked a lot about whether a resource was good or not. And I don't know your students. So even if I think a resource is amazing, it may still not be appropriate for your students. And so what I wanted to do was work to educate educators about what are the questions that I ask when I look at a resource. And just because everything passes here doesn't mean it's a good resource. So you may still decide with your professional judgment that just because all the answers are like, yes, this is amazing, 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 but you know what? I still think it may not work for my students. And that is, again, your space of professional judgment. So, but these are the questions that I think about when I'm looking at a resource. So does the resource contain traditional Indigenous stories? We will talk about those a little bit more in a while, but for now, just thinking about, we want to pay close attention if the story contains traditional Indigenous stories, and we want to watch for the items that I'm going to speak to later. And when I say traditional Indigenous stories, these are stories that we called myths and legends a while ago. Dr. Debbie Reese and Gregory Younging have wonderful articles about just challenging that language and how it can be very dismissive of Indigenous, traditional Indigenous stories. And so I encourage you, when you are talking about stories, to call them stories. And if you're talking about a specific kind, I talk about traditional Indigenous stories, and folks tend to know what I'm talking about. But and if you're wanting to learn more, again, Gregory Younging and Dr. Gregory Younging and Dr. Debbie Reese have both written on the topic in a little more detail. Does the resource contain Indigenous art? And so this is, I will say that Indigenous stories and Indigenous art don't actually exist in the sense that art and stories come from specific nations. And so even though we use Indigenous art or Indigenous stories as an umbrella term, when we see them referenced specifically, you will see them connected to a nation. And so we talk about Haida art or Tsimshian art. When we look at the art, we want to just make sure that the artist has been acknowledged, that we're recognizing the nation, that it, not that you can know for sure, but we're looking for signs that it hasn't just been copied off the internet and replicated with no acknowledgement or compensation to the artist, no permission given. We want to be sure that we've done everything in our power to just make sure that it has been respectful of the artist. I'm going to take a quick peek here. Okay. Yes, I did hear about that. So Leyton has put in here, Joe Crona just wrote a piece that we can't decolonize assessment. And so, yes, that is in fact true. And I had a big conversation about it with Nikki. And so the other thing that's wonderful about Indigenous peoples, and this is why I would encourage you to have broad perspectives, invite broad perspectives, because we actually all have different perspectives on things as well. And so I always encourage students to go out and find different perspectives on things. And so anyways, I won't debate the conversation about assessment, but I would encourage you to think about assessment in lots of different ways, and work in your own classroom to think about ways that I would say that the most important point in that previous slide was about connected to making sure that we're not doing things to have students feel that they're forced to assimilate in order to be successful in our classrooms. And so does the resource contain references or depictions of ceremonial information? And so we're looking at the resource. This is often, so in, for example, Potlatch's pedagogy, I've described the potlatch, and even in Dancing with Our Ancestors, I've described the potlatch, but I haven't given specific information so that folks would feel like they could replicate the ceremony. And so that's sort of the guideline that I tend to use when I'm looking at ceremonial information. I also look at who is sharing the information. So I feel most comfortable with resources that have that kind of information in it when it is being shared by somebody who comes from the same nation. So if I were if I were to write about Tsimshian practices, you would probably, I would encourage you to question what I was doing, because I don't know the nuances of that nation's practices. And so we want to just take a look at that. And does the resource honor diversity of Indigenous peoples? And so this is where we're recognizing that we have different nations. And so we expect to see references. So you'll notice that when Leyton introduced me, he introduced me as Haida. He didn't introduce me as Indigenous. And so recognizing those specific connections to nations. And the only exception with this one is when we're thinking about collective experiences that Indigenous peoples may have had. So an example would be residential schools. So when we're talking about multiple nations intentionally, that's when we would see that. And then the last one is, does the resource portray Indigenous peoples authentically and accurately? And generally, this encompasses all the previous questions, but another part to this kind of review is looking at who's the publisher, looking at what is being referenced, where the information is coming from, and just making sure generally that you know, that the information is coming from reliable sources. So I'm going to pause there. There tend to be questions with this part. I'm not sure if this was a question. Oh, try to turn off cameras for bandwidth. I guess maybe some people are having trouble with bandwidth. So there is a request from Leyton. So what I have here are questions to just think about our practice. I would invite you, if you have a couple questions, if you need a stretch, you can do that. And I think we'll start again at 4:05, but I'll watch the chat if you want to share some reflections about what's happening in your school, resources you found, education book. And I'll just pause for a moment in case folks need to get up and stretch. And if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat.
Thanks, Sarah. You can put your question in the chat, or you could unmute for these little 4 minutes, folks, if you've got a question. And my apologies, Sarah, for trigger figuring and putting that in the chat box too soon there.
That's no problem. It's actually it's a big discussion, but I'll just say that I'm learning to carve right now from my father, and he is what he does is I have to copy different things as I'm carving, and he then looks at it and tells me what I need to fix or what I need to change. And so it's quite an interesting process. And as I'm engaged in that process, I'm thinking about, he's got a very specific skill in his mind that he's hoping that I will learn. And he's making sure I do it until I get it right. And I keep making the same project until he feels I'm ready to move on. So food for thought.
So maybe as we get back, we can invite people to pop something in the chat box related to one of the questions. We may have sent them off there to their break.
Okay.
We were listening to a Cooper Island in my class.
Oh, I'm having trouble hearing you now, I guess. Okay. Let me just see. I wonder if I'm, so yes, is that with Duncan McHugh?
Leyton, I think it's your Wi-Fi because Sarah's is good. I think you might be having trouble with your connection there.
Great. All right. I will just listen and enjoy.
Could I just ask a question?
Absolutely.
So I'm still kind of struggling with the whole thing because, like you were talking about, indigenization needs to come from people with the Indigenous ancestry, and I full on agree. But a lot of times when we're going in to different workshops and stuff, we're being specifically asked not to overuse our Indigenous peoples that are willing to speak to us, because some of the elders in particular are being pulled for so much information, and we kind of got this thing of, it's not their job to always teach you, and it's not their job to always be there. And so I'm just trying to figure out how to do both of those things.
So that's a great question. And I took out a slide that speaks to that exactly. But one of the things that we want to be sure about is it doesn't necessarily mean that we are having Indigenous people, that we're having that direct contact. But what I mean is that we wouldn't be relying on resources that have been created by non-Indigenous people to guide us in the process of indigenization. And so there are so many resources out there that can support indigenization work. My goodness, I am so sorry. I'm just going to let my pup in. He somehow managed to escape the barriers of downstairs, which means that he, I'm so sorry. It means that he's in danger of falling down the stairs because he's made it all the way up. Okay, so what it means though is that we want to be looking at work that has been developed by Indigenous peoples. And so when we look at those questions that I had on the previous slide, we want to be sure that we are drawing on those resources and not looking to non-Indigenous interpretations of Indigenous perspectives. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, like I said, I'm just trying to find the balance. And like you said, so many things now, because some of the books that we used to use as these, wonderful things, and now we're like, well, no, you shouldn't be using that book anymore. And so there's so many things to try to keep on top of.
I completely agree. And I think that when I'm doing those activities, when I'm doing those reviews, I'm doing them continuously, because I agree there are books that I loved that I will no longer use in my classroom. And so I would consider it like I would actually be looking at books annually at the very minimum, just to make sure that we want to, that we are up to date and we're doing the best that we can. And one of the things that I say is when we do these questions, we're not necessarily guaranteeing that things that are problematic won't get through. But what what will happen is that we have gone through a process to look at them, and so it means that probably we'll make decisions that will prevent or inhibit really problematic resources from coming through. But we'll also, people are going to still come forward to us and share with us why particular things are problematic. And Dr. Debbie Reese has her blog is excellent. And there have been resources that I have thought were okay, and then they turned out not to be. And so I'm always learning, and I make different choices as I go along. But I appreciate your comment about we don't want to tax folks who are engaged in this work. And especially there are so many resources out there that are available to us. And so we'll often talk about doing homework before we even approach anybody. But there's so much available that we can do this work. We just want to be sure that we're relying on those Indigenous voices as opposed to non-Indigenous voices to lead us in the work of indigenization. And so whether it's a virtual voice or a voice through text, we just want to be sure that we have that. I will say books that I loved. So there's a question here. There's some wonderful resources that are being shared. So thank you very much to those folks who are sharing them. I used to use Joseph Boyden. I no longer use Joseph Boyden. I used to use Sherman Alexie. I no longer use Sherman Alexie. I would say those are the two right now that I can think off the top of my head that would be relevant to secondary.
Thanks, Sarah. Shall we move on to chunk 2?
Session 1, Dreaming an Indian Keeper in Me, Outside Circle and Urban Tribes. Wonderful. Okay. So as we transition into traditional stories, I really love this quote by Linda Toohey Smith, because it really speaks to why it's so important for us to engage with story. And so she says, each individual story is powerful, but the point about the stories is not that they simply tell a story or tell a story simply. These new stories contribute to a collective story in which every Indigenous person has a place. For many Indigenous writers, stories are ways of passing down the beliefs and values of a culture in the hope that the new generations will treasure them and pass the story down further. The story and the storyteller both serve to connect the past with the future, one generation with the other, the land with the people, and the people with the story. So as another sort of seed for folks to think about, I wanted to include this, I would say an example of Indigenous literacy, or specifically Haida literacy, which is the use of images. And this is a carved panel by my brother called Raven and the First People. And so Raven and the First People is one of our creation stories. So I included here because this is the work that I'm sort of starting to explore now, is the representation of our stories visually. And so just something to think about as we move forward about, you know, how are we sharing stories, and what literacies predated contact. So I love this quote, or, you know, this information from Daniel David Moses, and it's really helped to frame so much of the work that I do. And he talks about the purposes of storytelling are to entertain, to educate, and to heal. And so often when we're thinking about storytelling, we're really familiar with entertainment. We're getting more familiar with the purpose, you know, with education. And I would say that we're still very emergent in our understanding of how storytelling can heal, but you may have personal experiences to that would speak to that. So, sorry, for some reason my arrows aren't working to advance my slides, so I just have to do that. So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with Dr. Joanne Archibald Kwamhiam, and some of her most recent work is talking about Indigenous story work and how we become story ready. And so when we're beginning to do this work, we want to engage in respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. And so for those of you who are familiar with her work, those are the first 4 principles, her Indigenous story work principles. And so we're thinking about how can we learn from stories? What can we do to get ready to listen to a story? How can we treat stories with respect? And how can we make sure the story can teach others? She also talks about making meaning from stories. And so those are connected to holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And as many of you know, I really love to do diagrams to sort of show my thinking and for me to engage with ideas. And so you'll notice that for storytelling, everything is really cyclical. And that is because I firmly believe that we need to come back to stories over time. I teach an Education 100 course, and we start the course by reading On the Trapline by David A. Robertson. And then we spend the course reading Blackwater, which is his memoir. And then we come back to On the Trapline again to kind of accelerate that experience of engaging with a story, and then learning, and then re-engaging with a story, and perhaps having a new understanding of that story. And so we're able to accelerate that with this, I don't know if those of you who are familiar, On the Trapline is sort of a little micro version of something that happened in the memoir. And so the students have a much deeper understanding, and they get a sense of what's being alluded to in the picture book. So let's just see here. So this is what I'm always asked about in terms of sharing traditional stories. And so just keeping in mind there are specific protocols to working with stories that will be connected to the local nations, but these ones I would say tend to be fairly generalized. And then if you hear of other protocols, please do obviously follow them if there are some that are very specific to the local nation. Choose a story that you have permission to retell. So this means that the nation or an individual who owns the story has given permission for it to be shared publicly or in an educational context. You want to look for evidence of this when you choose the story. When you just because something has been published does not mean that you can that this work has been done. When you're telling the story, you want to maintain the integrity of the story. So because it's been translated from another language, you want to be sure that all of the different parts to the story remain intact, and research the context to be shared with each telling. And so often in recordings, you'll hear somebody when they start to tell the story, they'll say, where the story comes from, why they're allowed to share it. And that information should be told with each retelling. And just keep in mind that just because you have been given permission to share a story does not mean you're given permission to give permission to others to share a story. And so you always just want to have clarity on some of the protocols around sharing a story. So some common approaches to using stories, and I don't like saying using. I should change the slide to say working with stories or learning from stories, because I definitely don't like saying using it. It's sort of it feels like I'm being disrespectful to the story. But these come from again Dr. Joanne Archibald's work, but it's from 1994. She did a grade 3 book. And it's out of print, but I understand that she's working to update it. And it's a really wonderful resource that she developed about, working with stories. And so she says that they're often told with no explanation, and it's expected that the listeners will go away and think about the story. Often we'll use a sharing circle to discuss aspects and individual understandings. Role playing is another way to engage with the story physically. And then she also recognizes that stories need to be told and felt over and over again. And an example is Lady Louse, which is a wonderful recording that she did online. I've heard that story so many times, and I don't ever get tired of listening to it. And I do think about different things when I'm listening to it. And so this idea of, we think about it as recursive, engaging recursively with the story, coming back to it, is such an important way to make meaning from stories. So in one of her videos, she talks about engaging holistically with stories. And so engaging mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I asked her, I said, is it okay if I kind of take this idea and expand on it a little bit? Because I found it to be really, really helpful. So, in terms of, we engage mentally by listening to the story, but this idea of physical engagement was, and she mentioned it, as you noted in the previous slide, about role playing. And when we're role playing with story, we want to be mindful that we're not doing a reenactment of the story for others. We're engaging physically with the story for the purpose of understanding it more deeply. And I'll share with you a little activity afterwards, but it's been quite profound, the difference that happens when people are willing to engage with the story physically. And I will say, well, I'll save that for after, but the one kind of reminder that I offer is that when we're engaging physically, we want to remind the students that this story does belong to somebody else. And so we want to be respectful of that. And so what that means is that, or, you know, how I've done it is I've sort of let students know we're going to engage physically with the story. We're going to engage in role play, but we are also going to imagine that the person who owns the story is here in the room with us. And you know, we hope that they're feeling good and feeling that we are being respectful of that story. In the early times when I did this activity, I didn't set those parameters up, and I found that because I hadn't done that, it got a little bit out of hand, and I was really uncomfortable with how the students were engaging with the story. And so once I've set up those parameters, things have changed quite quickly. So emotionally, we reflect on the story, we think about how our experiences connect with those of the character, and spiritually, we think about what does the story teach us. And so that led to the development of this activity, which I call holistic engagement with story. And so it begins, and I encourage people to choose a story. First of all, it needs to be a story that you have permission to work with. But I encourage folks to think about local stories for this activity. It can be so powerful to work with a story that is local. And if that's not possible, that is entirely okay. You can work with other stories, but it can be very, you know, when we think about localizing, it is possible, you know, it can be quite powerful to do that. So the way I do this activity is I have my large group of students, I divide them into small groups, and then we all sit in a circle. I share the story with them. They then gather with their small group. They review the story. Sometimes I give them the text version. Sometimes I just ask them to remember it together. And then they work with their group to create a small dramatic representation of either what happens next in the story, or they recreate an aspect of the story. You'll notice again that this is not a reenactment of the story for others. The main purpose of the activity is that small group engagement. And I invite students, if they want to share it with others, they can, but mainly the important part for me is that they engage physically in their small group. It can be wonderful to see what other people come up with, but you know, that's not the point. Is not for everybody to see it. The point is to engage physically, because there is a deeper meaning that is made when they do that. And I will say that every single time, we do this activity, the first 10 to 15 minutes are fairly excruciating, because people are mad that they have to engage in drama or physically. But eventually they kind of come to a place of being quite, you know, in the end, when we kind of debrief the activity, it's quite powerful. And I've done activities where I've had students just listen to the story and then do a sharing circle. And I've done it where we listen to the story and then we engage physically, and it's quite transformational. So I would encourage you to try it, to just try engaging differently. I have another kind of pause, break, reflection built in here. So I am going to pause until 4:29-ish. Here are some questions if you want to share. I notice there's lots of sharing going on in the chat. If you have questions, you can ask them, but I'll pause until, 4:29. So I don't know, Tara, I can't look at your link right now, but are you talking about the Salish weave, or are you talking about Lady Louse? Okay. Thank you.
Those ones are interesting short stories, those ones.
I find Thomas King can be tricky to use with students depending on their levels of understanding, just because he relies on satire so much that you really need to know your students to know whether they're going to be taking away the messages you know, that you're hoping they will take away from it. Have folks worked with traditional stories? Yes, Angela, thank you. It is quite remarkable in terms of how transformational. I'm sure that many of you worked with stories and just sort of talked in small groups or in a large group of what they believe the teaching is. And that level of physical engagement is very, very transformational in terms of the meaning that folks make from the story. I just worked with folks in the Okanagan who did it. I kind of set up the activity and then they did it, and they were also quite amazed by the difference.
Sarah, can I ask you a really logistical question to build on my question? So you say, listen to the story. So the second thing, meet in your small group. And so how long, that's the logistical question. How long would you give them? Like I would want to trap them in like observing and obviously seeing the messy middle. But I'm just thinking of how open you leave it with groups of students you've worked with.
So I have predominantly worked with adults for this activity. And so you're talking about step 4?
Yes, and more like not with adults, more like with rascally teenagers, not with teenagers.
So 20 minutes seems to be, like, I would say 15 to 20, maybe 17 is the sweet spot. You'll know your group, and as you know, like it'll go you know, the sound obviously changes. I have not had folks go longer than 25 minutes is sort of the max, and that's a really engaged group of students. So, but I find that if you give them the text, so there are different protocols for how a story can be shared. So for example, I've used the Digital Scowlets website and the retelling. There's a story that's retold on there. You are only permitted to use that story as it has been shared. And so I don't provide a text for that one. But there's other stories, like there are stories in that Dr. Archibald has shared that they are in text. So I'll read the exact text when I'm sharing the story the first time. If they have a text to go through, it can take a bit longer because they become really focused on what does it say. So that can impact things as well. When I was up on Haida Gwaii, we worked with a Haida story, and again, they had the text. And I mean, that was really, really powerful because we had folks who were part of dance groups. And so when they were retelling parts of the story, they actually brought in songs and paddle songs as they were paddling a canoe. So it was quite powerful. Okay, I think looking at all my devices, I think we're on, oh, what? Sharing. That's great. And one of the things I have just responding to Vicky's comment, I've also taught students Indigenous pedagogy, so specifically working with the First Peoples Principles of Learning. And so I'm having my students do that tomorrow, looking at the picture books and coming to, what does this teach us about this specific First Peoples Principle of Learning? How is it illustrated in this story? I steer away from comprehension questions when I'm working in this way with stories. I tend to ask more, I guess, more subjective questions, questions that rely on an emotional connection, just because I feel like that's a way to honor the stories. So I think that's great. Okay, so we're now on to learning from each other. Woo. So this is a photograph of my father and I know many of you are familiar with Potlatch's pedagogy. And so I use this photograph because it shows the two of us working in his studio together. And that's where almost all of our work takes place. As I mentioned earlier, I'm now learning to carve from him. And so the work that I did to begin, with Potlatch's pedagogy was I did sit with him and make meaning from stories. And so I wanted to offer this as an example for how I made meaning from my father's stories and eventually kind of came to the SCADA principles. And so what I did was I listened to his stories. I made meaning from his stories. I identified the themes in what I was learning. I shared what I heard with my father. I shared what I learned. I listened to him and I reflected on my new learning and shared what I'd learned when I had permission. And so this idea of making meaning from stories is not just sort of an interpretation. It feels more engaged to me. And so because we are active participants, and for those of you who are familiar with Rosenblatt, it's that similar idea of what we bring to a story, our personal experiences, impacts the meaning that we make from the story. And it was quite interesting for me as a master's student, when I first looked at Rosenblatt's work, I was like, wait a second here, that's what we do with our stories, with our traditional stories. And so later on, when I read Dr. Archibald's work, I kind of came to that realization of, wow, she had captured this way of working with stories that we had been also doing for a very long time. And so you'll see here this cycle, this circle of working with stories. And in this case, I was doing research and learning from my father's stories. You'll see here that I've bolded those the kind of middle steps, because you can kind of keep going in that section for a little while until you get it right. And so again, I would go to my dad, I would listen to his story, I would go away, I would think about it, I would come back, say, this is what I think I understand. And then he may say yes, or no, and then, it would continue on cyclically. And so I really appreciate, again, going back to Kwam Kwamhyam. She says, since stories can be heard again and again, the meanings that one makes or doesn't make from them can happen at any time. And so, as I mentioned previously, the result of engaging with my father and listening to his stories resulted in these SCADA principles. And there are 9 principles here. Because I cluster them, people tend to think there are 3 and maybe get a little bit overwhelmed, but there are these 9 principles. Learning emerges from strong relationships, authentic experiences, and curiosity. Learning occurs through observation, contribution, and recognizing and encouraging strengths. And learning honors the power of the mind, history and story, aspects of spirituality and protocol. And so what happened as a result of those principles, but I worked on Potlatch's pedagogy with my father, and then I sort of started thinking about some of the stories that he told me, and I thought, I think these could be really powerful learning tools for educators, for students. And so I had this idea to share, or to co-author Jigging for Halibut with Chinny with my father, because I thought it was a really great story, and it really illustrated a different way of learning. So intergenerational learning in place, authentic experiences. So many of the SCADA principles were illustrated in this story. So I went to the publisher, and they actually wanted 4 books. And so these books really, for me, are learning stories, which I'm going to segue into now. And so there's stories around learning. I didn't write them with the intention of writing a story about a SCADA principle. I tried to capture the stories that my father told me, that we shared, that helped me to better understand the SCADA principles. And so several of the SCADA principles are embedded in each one of the stories, but that's because they were part of the stories and they helped me to learn the SCADA principles. In books 1 and 2, my father is learning. In books 3 and 4, he's more teaching. And books 1 and 2, it's his perspective. Books 3 and 4, it's my perspective. And in book 1, he's a grandson. In book 2, he's a son. In book 3, he's a father. And book 4, he's a grandfather. And the hope that I had with these stories was to really bring in a broader audience, first of all, to learn more about Indigenous pedagogies in a really accessible way. The beauty of writing picture books and writing stories in this way is that they are accessible to a much broader audience. I also wanted folks who maybe didn't have the opportunity to grow up and have the experiences that I had. So I had these amazing opportunities to go to fish camp, to go to potlatches. I wanted to invite them into these experiences to learn more about Indigenous pedagogies. And so these emphasize intergenerational learning. They emphasize sort of cultural, how do we pass cultural knowledge, and land-based teachings. And so those stories all centered around experiences of learning. And so here, this is just a page from the teacher guide. I worked with Katya Adamov Ferguson to create a teacher guide. And so you'll notice with these activities, they're really focused around engaging with the story. And most of them, I would say, work well with any age. And you'll notice here, use the mentor text for personal narratives. So my hope was, even as I was writing them, that secondary teachers would feel comfortable bringing them into classrooms to share as mentor text for personal, narratives or narrative stories, essays. They're 1,000-word essays, if you will, that are told in the first person. And when I was a high school teacher, one of the dreams that I had was that I would have my secondary students writing books and then doing buddy reading with the younger learners. We got to the buddy reading part, but we didn't get to the part where my students were writing stories to share, and that there would be this reciprocity of sharing stories. Definitely, there's a lot of focus on artistic interaction with the stories. Because of the way that these stories were created, I encourage people to learn from family members, from community members, and if they have permission to share some of those stories, the depth of relationships that can be built through these sharing of stories. When I do it, even just as an activity with my university students, it's so powerful. And so I feel very honored that the students share with me the stories that they do. I've had stories of them learning calligraphy. So when I invite them to share their learning stories, I get these stories of intergenerational learning, gardening, cooking, that are really centered in those family relationships, in community relationships, And it overwhelmingly has transformed what's happened in the classroom to sort of value knowledge that comes from other sources. And so in a post-secondary institution, we do value reading articles and reading texts and, you know, peer-reviewed and all those things, but it's so important that we also invite in knowledge that comes from intergenerational learning. And this has been one way that I've been able to do that in my classroom, in my class. So just to briefly, I find it sometimes is helpful to separate out. Traditional stories often include supernatural beings, often describe how something came to be or learning a lesson, have been passed on for generations, may include creation stories from specific nations, and are usually told without a specific lesson. You will notice more recently that some of those lessons have been added on. I believe personally that those were added on because of the ways that, for example, Aesop's fables are told, where there is that one learning or one teaching. If it's okay, I would encourage you to share those stories without that, because there are often other teachings that students will take from them. Life experience stories or learning life experience stories are based on the teller's lived experience or someone they know. So in the case of the first two stories, I'm sharing with permission my father's stories. So they're not necessarily my stories, but they're his experiences. So they're based on interviews. They're usually told chronologically. They usually center around the teller's lived experiences. And they work best when they are told without a specific lesson. So you'll notice with both of them, when we want to invite that kind of interaction, that learning from the story, you'll find that it does tend to work better if there is no explicit lesson shared. If you decide that you would like to do this, and this is a relatively simple activity, and you've probably done something similar, but I just have found I learned so much from the students by engaging in this. So generally, if we're focused in on learning stories, we want to invite them to share a story of learning something that's physical. I had a wonderful story about a student learning to play video games. That was really interesting, but it becomes trickier. With the exception of When I Was 8, the book, it can be trickier to tell a great story about learning something that is kind of more based in a cognitive skill. So I encourage people to think of some sort of physical skill that they've learned. And it tends to work really well when it is learning from another person. So tell about how you learn to, whatever it is. What I love about this is there can be such a range, so people don't necessarily feel they have to divulge something deep, dark, secret, but they can share something, anything with you. Tell about a time you learned an important lesson through an experience. Tell about a time when you figured something out all by yourself. And I tend to get the cooking stories are beautiful. And what I love about these is that, again, they offer these opportunities to share these really beautiful stories, but they don't necessarily have to be kind of oversharing information that they may not feel comfortable sharing. So my suggested progression for writing learning stories is to begin by reading examples. And as we know, reading examples is really, really helpful. So when I'm teaching the university course, I read stories, I read picture books every single day. So they have loads of examples by the time that they come to writing theirs. We identify qualities of learning stories, what makes them work, what makes them not work. Inviting students to attend to sensory details. So my experience with learning stories, as with most writing, is that when we have those sensory details, they are really important. And so the work that I did with the Scotta stories was to really think about the experience and try and immerse the reader in those experiences. The other decision that I made, which students may or may not be interested in doing, is I never used people's names in the stories. And that was because when when I'm telling the story about my cousin and my brother and all of us at fish camp, I wanted the reader to imagine their brother, their cousin, their sibling, their nibbling, like whoever in that story. So it invites people, it invites the reader to engage a little more fully. Brainstorming ideas for the learning stories with students, inviting them to think individually of stories. So if you can leave those prompts and continue to have them available to students, I use a Google Doc so that they have access to those ideas later on, so that if they try one and it doesn't work. And then starting orally, even with my adult students, being able to tell a story orally first is really helpful. They can get the feedback, clarifying questions. They can make a note of what they need to think more on, and invite them to bring a draft, to begin on a draft. And remember that stories can be told in so many different ways. It's not only text-based. I chose text-based, but they don't necessarily need to be text-based. These are some stories. These are some of the stories that I use in my classroom. I tend to use nonfiction with adults and secondary. I find that picture books that are nonfiction tend to go over better. The Pencil is a wonderful story. Tana's Owl and Tana's Lemming kind of come across as quite young, but they're interesting because they are based on the author's experiences growing up in the North. Richard Wagame's One Native Life is fantastic. And then there are other essays by Richard Wagame's, which are, I mean, as you know, he's an amazing writer. And so I've drawn on a lot of his work. I tend to prefer these shorter stories so that we have time to really dive into the craft of the writing as we're looking at them. So I am going to end there and leave the last words to Kwam Kwamhiam. And she says, through experience, critical reflection, and discussion, I learned that the story listener learner is implicitly given space and time to make story meaning with and through the story at this juncture. The story may have stopped, but this does not mean that the story is finished. And so I'd invite you, when you're working with your students, to continue to return to stories, to engage with stories. And I just find that it really helps to build those relationships. And I hope that you never see stories as finished, because they do continue to live. So
Thank you, Sarah. Folks, we're going to invite you to offer us something in the chat box that struck you, something you're taking away, something that resonated with you, something you're going to deepen. But this is your chance to give us a little waterfall of what you're taking away. So we invite you to do that as Sarah gets a chance to look. Sarah, it's a delight to get to work with you. And of course, in the introduction, I should have mentioned, not just are you a scholar, but you're also an author. And so how nice for us to see some of your books, hear about how you're using them. And I did not realize the chronological order of the series of 4 that went from grandson to son to father to grandfather. I'm going to reread them tonight when I get home. So
yeah, it was very exciting to think about, to come to that idea, because when I sort of had 1 in mind and they came back with 4, I was like, oh. But then I was really excited about the possibility to actually model that intergenerational learning and the responsibilities we have with teaching based on our ages. So,
folks, if you can warm up your fingers and pop something in the chat box, something you appreciated, something you're taking away, something that resonated with you. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Jen. Sarah, I popped in the chat box that Anona has been doing work with us in classrooms outdoors, where she tells the 4 food chiefs, and then kids are retelling parts of the food chiefs with a focus on one of the particular chiefs to understand that food chief's perspective. And doing it outside has been incredible. Look at that love in the chat box.
beautiful. Thank you.
And just as we close, Tammy, do you want to offer Sarah some words as I just pop up the slide one last time?
Sure, Sarah, I just want to say thank you so much. I, like Leyton, also loved that your dad was in the different roles in the 4 stories. I thought that was beautiful too. And so practical. I want all of our folks to be able to go back to this session as they look at how they can support students in finding their own voices. So just thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you so much for including me. Very exciting. Thank you.
Well, folks, I don't think we can top Sara Florence Davidson next time, but in the final session of this series,
Sarah, come back.
our very own Tammy Renyard, Heather Brown, Vicki Roberts, and I will be doing literacy across the curriculum, folks. So we'll be thinking about and taking up literacy from different content area perspectives and also looking at connections across the curriculum. But for now, I say how beautiful that we can leave today thinking about story, what story offers us. And Sarah, I just love the point that we don't always have to be looking for a theme in the story, that stories offer us the knowledge that they're offering us, and we don't have to turn them into an academic exercise, but instead we can experience them holistically. I'm taking that away today.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody. Love you in a professional way, and see you for session 3, April 3rd, after spring break. Take care, everybody.
Bye, folks. Thank you.